Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Anna, we just heard that you hit 500,000 subscribers on YouTube, and congratulations.
Well, thank you. You know what? I'm thrilled.
Do you mind if we come in and ask you some questions on behalf of the OYM community?
Sure, why not? Come in. I have time.
Great, thank you so much. So, where are we?
Well, you are standing in my home in central Niagara.
What's the best thing about living in the Niagara region?
Oh my goodness. Well, for me, it's all about the produce. The food here that's grown locally is just delicious. And I love this place every season.
Are you originally from this area?
You know what? That's a good question. Come into the kitchen.
Ooh, looks like you're making something.
Oh, of course, of course. But I can cook and talk at the same time. It's like a thing I do. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up in Toronto, but I've lived in Niagara for over 20 years now.
That looks like cream cheese. What exactly are you making?
Well, I'm making a dessert and having a coffee too. Do you want a coffee?
I would love a coffee, thank you.
There you go.
What do you usually take in your coffee?
I take lots of milk, but guess what? No sugar. Shh. I save the sugar for the dessert. And this is a pumpkin chocolate trifle. So it's the right time of year, and I love pumpkin desserts, but I always like to add a little twist. So for me, pumpkin and chocolate is a perfect combination.
Speaking of flavors that go great in the fall, what's your favorite thing to bake on a fall day?
Well, quite frankly, I love anything with cinnamon in it this time of year. I'm putting cinnamon into this pumpkin mousse. I've got some cream cheese and pumpkin puree. I've got ginger and some allspice too, but really, this time of year, it's all about the cinnamon.
What's the greatest thing about being a baker?
That's kind of a broad question. Well, I mean, you could say, well, it's the desserts, but honestly, it's the emotion behind baking. I think most people who love baking know it's about the sense of sharing, the fulfillment you get from making something and then being able to share it with others.
Do you have any good dessert recipes that don't require an oven?
Yeah, this one.
Anna, what is always in your fridge?
Well, that's a very good question to ask. We can take a peek. You want to take a look?
That would be great.
All right. Oh, fingers crossed I clean the fridge. Well, first off, I have to point out the collection of mustards. It's a bit disproportionate, but I don't know. I guess I'm afraid, I could run out of mustard, so I buy lots. But this is really what you need to see. The dairy bin.
That is a lot of cheese.
Cheese is my weakness. I could honestly, I think, give up eating sweets, but not making them, just eating them. But don't touch my cheese. While I'm here, I have to grab some whipped cream.
Anna, why did you decide to become a chef?
It was a deliberate choice, but it took me a long time to figure it out. I grew up loving baking. It was always my after-school hobby, and I learned to bake a lot from my grandmother. But it wasn't until I had finished studying political science, worked in banking for a few years, wasn't happy, and I realized it was cooking and baking that was making me happy. So boom, I made the switch.
Anna, on behalf of the OYM community, we are so much happier with you as a baker than a banker. What was your favorite childhood dessert when you were growing up?
That's an easy one, ice cream sundaes.
Is there a flavor of ice cream that you'd really like to try?
I feel like I've tried a lot of them. Pistachio is one of my favorite flavors, but I will say I'm not fond of ice cream with bits in it. So long as it doesn't have pieces and chunks, I'll try it.
If you were to make a birthday cake for yourself, what kind of cake would you make?
That's easy. I would make a golden vanilla cake with a double fudge frosting.
If someone was starting out as a new baker, what recipe would you recommend that they start with?
Well, you know what? It's not about the experience so much, but if you have not a lot of baking tools around because you're just getting started, then I would say start with chocolate chip cookies. If you have a mixing bowl, a spoon, and a baking tray, you can make chocolate chip cookies.
What is the best choice of chocolate for making chocolate chip cookies?
Well, now I favor dark chocolate, and I actually use my baking chocolate in my chocolate chip cookies, but really I'm not going to stop you from making those cookies, so whatever you have on hand or you and your family like, just go for it.
Anna, there are a ton of videos on this channel that teach people how to cook different recipes. Who taught you all of these recipes?
Well, I did mention earlier, I grew up baking with my grandmother, and I think that's where the love of baking and learning a lot of the sort of Eastern European recipes you see me make here on OYUM come from. But I did go to cooking school and I worked in the industry for a number of years. So it's just come with repetition and practice and lots of taste testing and making mistakes as I go too.
Did you go to culinary school?
I did. I went to Johnson & Wales University, and for a few years they had a campus in Vail, Colorado.
Do you need to go to culinary school to become a baker?
You don't technically have to, but I will say that your comprehension and the applied learning from getting that foundation theory of cooking and baking will just skyrocket your career path just a lot faster.
Anna, there are a ton of people in the OYUM community who want to become better bakers. Can we ask you some of their frequently asked baking questions?
I think that'd be great.
So when I'm baking, how do I not make a giant mess?
What? Isn't baking about making a giant mess? Well, actually, I think one of the fundamental tips for that ease is cleaning as you go. It's a habit I picked up working as a baker when you have to work early morning and there's no one else to do the dishes but you. So I'm gonna make a stop to the sink now. Tidy as you go.
What is the purpose of using unsalted butter in a recipe?
Oh, I like that question because I'm a big fan of unsalted butter because I want to be in charge of the salt. And depending on the recipe, your salt requirements vary. And of course, you're using different amounts of butter. So stay in charge. Use unsalted butter.
What is the difference between baking powder and baking soda?
Oh, getting really technical here. But guess what? Baking powder is baking soda, but it already has the acidity added to it necessary to activate it. Baking soda, you have to add that in by adding vinegar or lemon juice to your baking. The difference is baking powder needs heat to really come to life. So it activates when things are already in the oven, where baking soda starts activating even in your mixing bowl.
Can I sub brown sugar for palm sugar in baking?
I think generally you could. 1-to-1 you shouldn't have to change anything to your recipe.
What is the difference between all-purpose flour, plain flour, and cake and pastry flour?
You know what? I like to talk with my hands, so I'm gonna put this bowl down. Let's talk about wheat flour for a second, because it is important. I call for specific flour in my videos and recipes for a specific reason. So if you're making bread, and the yeast produces carbon dioxide and you want to hold that air in, you need to use bread flour, which is higher in protein. Now on the other end of the spectrum, when you want delicate cakes and pastries, you need a flour with a low amount of protein. The protein is what bonds things together. For a tender pastry, you use cake and pastry flour. Now all-purpose flour earns its name quite simply because it is kind of the good across the board flour, good for basic banana bread and cookies, and it simply sits in the middle in terms of that protein spectrum. Now, if you live in the UK, you can buy self-raising flour, which already has the baking powder in it, and you can also get plain flour, which is the same as our all-purpose flour.
When should I pack measure dry ingredients?
Well, you probably see me on these videos using volume measurements a fair bit. And I do like to use a scale actually for precision when it comes to measuring, because then it doesn't matter how you pack your measuring cup. But as a general rule with flour, you loosen up the flour in the canister, you can lightly scoop and then level. Granulated sugar, I'll just get right in there and give it a little shake to level it off. And brown sugar, well, that's the ingredient you want to pack into your measuring cup. Don't do that with your flour though.
Anna, our viewers can't bake in your own kitchen, so how can they compensate for their room temperature being different than yours?
Yes, I mean, well, even here in Niagara, a hot, humid summer day is very different from a cold, wintry day. I use room temperature, I call it 18 degrees Celsius. So on an average day, where room temperature is what's outside and inside, I would pull out my butter to soften to room temperature about an hour ahead of time. If it's a hot, humid day or you live in a hot climate, well, it only has to be 20 minutes to half an hour.
Anna, this viewer lives in Louisiana. They say their bread recipes don't climb the hook. Why would that be?
And you do want that. You want your dough, you know it has enough flour when it climbs the hook. So if it's stuck at the bottom of the bowl, I know why that is because I used to live in New Orleans and that humidity actually gets into the flour. So you actually have more moisture in a flour or in your dough than the average person would. So the solution? add a bit more flour. About half a cup. No, try adding just a little at a time, but about half a cup should do it.
This viewer lives in India. Their yeast rises really high. What can they do about that?
Well, just like that question coming from Louisiana, I would say that's because of the climate, not the yeast itself. So that hot weather really coaxes the yeast to life and does it quickly. So your solution would be to reduce the amount of yeast and then keep the timing the same, or to slow it down, you can pop the dough in a cool space or refrigerator, and that slows the fermentation. Then they should be fine.
Anna, this viewer likes a fluffy, airy cake. How do they make that happen?
Well, there are a couple of things you can do. A sponge cake then might be the perfect recipe because that calls for whipping eggs with sugar together to make them really light and airy, and the cake is light and airy. Or if you're doing a more conventional cake, well, that's when you could really beat your butter and sugar well. It's the first step in the recipe because from there that aerates and adds structure to the cake that'll make sure it's nice and fluffy. I need to pop over here and grab a measuring cup.
Sure. Anna, speaking of sponge cakes, why do mine turn out so dense?
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear about that, but it could be a couple of things. Did you know that when you're making a sponge cake, warm eggs whip to a higher volume than cold? So you can just pop the whole egg, shell and all, intact in a bowl of hot water and just let them warm up a little bit. Or another option is to, I'm sorry, I'm cooking and talking at the same time. Here I'm layering my pumpkin mousse in. Okay, back to the eggs and the sponge cake. The other thing you can do is just keep whipping. It sounds crazy, but you can't over whip whole eggs with sugar. So if you're ever in doubt, just keep going and going and going.
Speaking of whipping, what should I do if I overbeat whipped cream?
I have done that before. Decided I was going to make butter instead of whipping cream. So what I've learned, because even a professional does that, I hold back a couple of tablespoons of fluid whipping cream. That way, if I over whip my cream, you add the fluid cream to it and then don't use the beaters again, whisk it by hand. It'll break down the cream back to a smooth state, just like this pumpkin mousse.
What kind of chocolate is best for tempering?
Okay. Well, you need to use couverture chocolate. That is baking chocolate. So chocolate chips, like you use for chocolate chip cookies, is not the kind of chocolate you do for tempering, for good chocolate work. And you can buy it in blocks, you can buy it in chips. You do want to have a thermometer on hand because tempering is all about monitoring your temperature. But really, it's up to you. You can buy couverture chocolate in dark, milk, or white, so whatever you wish.
Do you have any tips for making a successful Italian meringue?
An Italian meringue is one that involves cooked sugar. So you know what? Your best tool is a thermometer to make sure you hit that 239 Fahrenheit, which when you carefully pour it into your whipping egg whites, will set the whites so they hold their volume.
Is there a butter alternative for baking?
There is. I may be a butter fan, but not everyone is. And I find the best option is virgin coconut oil. It behaves like butter and it stays solid at room temperature, so that's why it's the easiest substitution.
What substitute for mascarpone cheese can I use in tiramisu?
Well, you know what? This trifle is almost like a tiramisu. I'm layering chocolate cookie layers with a pumpkin mousse and a chocolate sauce, where tiramisu is ladyfingers and a coffee mousse. I used cream cheese here, so why not try cream cheese?
What can I substitute maple syrup for on top of cinnamon rolls?
Well, yes, it's true. Maple syrup is a very Canadian ingredient. Whatever you have that's sweet and sticky that you like on your sweet morning pastries, could be a bit of honey, golden syrup, whatever you have on hand should work just great.
Can I bake 2 cookie trays in the oven at the same time?
Well, now I don't know what everybody's oven is like, which is why you see in my recipes, I always call for a baking range, takes about 14 to 16 minutes. So I would say yes, but get to know your oven. You may find you have to rotate the trays because the top of the oven could be warmer or cooler than the bottom, depending where the heat source is.
How would you work with an oven that has 2 powerful fans that never stop?
That sounds like a serious oven. Working with a convection fan usually requires some accommodating. And so the easiest way is to reduce your oven temperature by 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's about 10 to 12 Celsius to make that difference. And then, because what the convection fan is doing is just blowing hot air around the oven, and that's why things cook or burn on the outside too quickly.
Speaking of serious ovens, where did you get your oven?
I know, it's a treasure of ours, and it was on its way to becoming scrap metal. It was being thrown away from a college cafeteria, and we have since rescued it and given it a good home. And it is obviously happy because it has behaved and just tested wonderful and probably thousands of recipes over the last almost 20 years.
Do you leave all cakes to cool in a pan?
Most cakes do need to stay in the pan to cool. Bread does not. You tip that out right away. But a cake is fragile when it comes right from the oven. So if you tip it out too soon, half of it may stay in the pan and the other half come out, and you don't want that. So I give most cakes about 15-20 minutes to cool before I tip them out.
Wow, those were a lot of baking tips. Thank you so much.
Good questions.
Can we talk a bit about how you start to develop a new recipe?
Sure, you know what? I start with simple inspiration. I always lean to the seasons first, so something as simple as pumpkin, all of a sudden I think of pumpkin spice, but I'm not in the mood for a heavy, dense pumpkin dessert. That's where the mousse comes in, and of course I love cinnamon, so I'm gonna add cinnamon. And then I wanna balance that sweetness with something sort of bitter and intense, and ta-da, here is the chocolate cookie crumble with my fudge sauce and the pumpkin mousse, and I've made a dessert.
What is the testing process usually like?
Well, this I have tested many, many times before. The first time it usually takes twice as long, and if I get it to taste good versus looking good, then I'm happy. I can always make it look good later on. It's about finding that balance of flavor and texture that makes me happy, but it can take 5 to 7 tries for me to get it right.
Are you working on any new recipes right now?
I'm always working on new recipes, but I do have a new project on the go, a brand new cookbook that will be released fall 2020 called Baking Day.
That cookbook sounds like something to look forward to. How long did it take you to identify ingredients without having to look at the labels?
You know what, that's funny, and I know where that question's coming from because I don't have labels on the videos you're watching when you watch me grab containers on Oh Yum, but even here around my kitchen I don't bother with labels because after a while you just get to know what all the ingredients look like. It didn't always work out that way. I remember one time as an apprentice making an entire batch of pecan sponge cake using salt instead of sugar. Oops. So if you're new to baking, label your canisters.
Have you ever had a new recipe invention completely fail?
I count on it. That sounds crazy, but I would be a failure without my failures. That's how I learn how to guide you not to make the same mistakes I do as I bake through the process. And it really teaches you about the science behind baking, and that's what gets me so excited.
How did you get into cookbooks?
Ooh, well that came about just kind of naturally. When I was a pastry chef on the 20 here in Niagara, I would be the one in charge of answering customer requests for recipes long before you could look them up on the internet. And after a while I realized, well, we have a collection of over 100, and that made a book.
Have you ever wanted to publish a cookbook in Spanish?
Well, you know what? I already have. I have 3. Repostería con Ana, más repostería con Ana, y fresco con Ana.
Well, you know what, Anna? It looks like you're just about done with that recipe. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. Look at those nice layers of the chocolate cookie crumble, the fudge sauce, and the pumpkin mousse.
So I've heard that members of your crew usually get to try the recipes when they're done. Does that mean we get to try this little dessert?
I think so, but you know what? It's still a little soft. We should give it a bit of time to cool. We could do the dishes in the meantime.
You know, that sounds great, but we actually have to do something for an hour, so we will come right back when that's all done with. Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, okay. I'll see you in a bit then.